Okay, we're back. This is the picture of those one-way valves. You can see how they almost look like the semilunar valves of the heart, allowing for one directional, unidirectional motion up the leg. You also have them in the upper parts of your leg and a little bit in your arms, but for the most part, they're very common in your legs. So let's talk about the distribution of blood in the body. So your heart, your arteries, and your capillaries have a very small percentage of the blood, which is kind of backwards of most people's thinking. Most people think, oh, the blood's pumping out of the heart, and so most of the blood at any given time is going to be in your arteries. Well, that's not right. And then the second train of thought is people say, well, you have tons of capillaries in your body compared to veins and arteries, so most of the blood's probably in your capillaries. Well, capillaries are so small that's not true either. In fact, the majority of the blood in your body at any given time, 60 to 65%, is within the veins. And that's because it's such a low pressure area in your veins. So it's almost like a traffic jam. The blood is pushing through the arteries, through the arterioles, through the capillaries. And then once it gets to the venous side, the venular side of the capillary, it's slow motion from there on back to the heart. The only thing getting it back are those unidirectional valves and the squeezing of skeletal muscle. There's also something called the respiratory pump. Just the expansion and contraction of your chest as you breathe is going to squeeze some of that blood back up into the heart. So very small percentage in all of the rest of the body. Here you can see the actual breakdown. I'm not going to ask you percentages. I don't care about that. But the big picture, the majority, again, is within the venous network. And here you can actually see, your heart at any given time has 7% of the blood. Kind of a fun Jeopardy fact, I guess. Let's talk about the capacitance of a blood vessel. The capacitance is the ability of that vessel to stretch. So there's a relationship that exists between blood volume and blood pressure. Veins are called capacitance vessels because they stretch more than arteries. Well, that makes sense that they stretch more than arteries because they are not constricted by all that smooth muscle, right? They're completely loosey-goosey, so to speak. So a venous response to blood loss, say you're hemorrhaging or, something, your arm gets cut off or something like that, your vasomotor centers are going to stimulate sympathetic nerves. And what that's going to do is allow those veins to constrict, vasoconstriction. Veins within the liver, the skin, the lungs, all of those kind of blood sinks that are spread throughout the body are going to redistribute the venous return and allow for increase to maintain blood volume as needed. So a total capillary blood flow is equal to your cardiac output. Your cardiac output, remember, was your heart rate times your stroke volume, how much blood you're pumping out of your heart and how many times your heart is beating in a minute. So your cardiac output is also determined by pressure and resistance within the cardiac system, within the cardiovascular system. So let's talk about these things. This is where the physiology picks up a little bit. Pressure, or P, is the ability for your heart to overcome that resistance that's there. So the absolute pressure is actually less important than the pressure gradient. It's really about the difference in pressure. Just like with osmosis, right? Things go from high to low, diffusion, everything goes from high to low concentration. We're thinking about the same thing here. Blood is going to flow from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure. So that's what we call a delta P, or a pressure gradient. This is the circulatory pressure. The big thing here is this is the difference between the pressure at that left ventricle right when it leaves the heart and the pressure at the peripheral end of the capillary beds. So what is that difference in pressure? That's going to predict how easily and quickly blood's going to flow to those areas. Flow is proportional to the difference in pressure. So flow equals the delta P, or the change in pressure from the heart to the peripheral capillaries, divided by R. And R is the resistance. So there's lots of things that are going to affect blood flow. Let's talk about them. First is the vessel length. The longer a vessel is, or the further it takes, the further away from the heart that part of the body is, the greater the resistance, right? So if we're talking about the pressure difference between going from your heart to your deltoid, your shoulder muscle, Well, that's a relatively small distance. It's going to be a relatively low effect on blood flow. But if we're talking about your heart pumping blood all the way down to your gastrocnemius, right, your calf muscle, that's a much longer distance. So that's going to affect the flow of blood greatly. It's increased resistance because of that distance there, that length of the blood vessel. Because the longer the vessel is, the more friction there is as that blood moves against the walls of that vessel. There's also vessel diameter. The smaller a blood vessel is, the greater the resistance. The larger a blood vessel is, the less the resistance. Let me erase my little, I really hope you guys can see this. I like to draw everything out, and I need a better eraser, obviously. So, kind of a hot mess today, sorry. I just got out of the shower, so my hair's kind of lovely right now. So if we're talking about flow, as vessel length increases, we're going to say flow decreases. Right, can you see that? As length increases, flow decreases. Then we have diameter. As the diameter increases, flow increases. Right? So here's a positive relationship, here's a negative relationship. As one goes up, the other goes down. As one goes up, the other goes up. What about vessel length and vessel diameter? The diameter is going to have a greater effect on flow than vessel length. So when it comes to the fact that, well, we're talking about something that's really far away, but it's really far away and it's traveling through a large vessel, well, then it might actually have a greater flow than something like, so here's a good example. Blood flow to your fingertip or blood flow to your knee, right? If you think about your heart, well, your fingertips are closer to your heart. Oops, I spelled length wrong. So really, it's a greater distance from your heart to your kneecap or whatever I just said. But because those vessels are larger and have a larger diameter, the blood flow is actually going to be higher going to that area than to our fingertip because the vessels are much smaller in our forearms. If that makes sense. The other thing that's going to affect blood flow is something called turbulence. Turbulence. ENC. Turbulence is all the other stuff that's in there. So maybe there's some plaque in the arteries or some other disturbances in there, maybe some scar tissue buildup or something like that. As turbulence increases, flow is going to decrease. It's going to cause, you can see this little effect down here, it's going to cause some swirling action, which we call turbulence, in the vessel. So it's going to impact flow. Here you can see in a nice graph form, for those of you who are graph people, the relationship between vessel diameter and blood pressure and all of that stuff. So here you see the vessel diameter in centimeters, and we're looking at as we go through the system. In other words, our elastic arteries and our vena cava, superior and inferior vena cava, the veins that dump back into the heart. Those are our largest diameter. Well, if we look at those large diameter vessels over here, and we're looking at the actual cross-section area of them, it's actually pretty small compared to, say, the capillaries. Or if we look here at blood pressure, our arteries and our veins, well, you see how that blood pressure drops right after we get through the capillaries. Remember I said it's kind of like a traffic jam going through there? And then same thing here with velocity of blood flow throughout the arteries and the vena cava. It's flowing much faster on the arterial side than it does on the venous side, and that's because of the blood pressure. So let's talk about blood pressure. How do we measure it? You measure it by taking the millimeters of mercury within the arteries, right? You can also measure what's called the capillary hydrostatic pressure and the venous pressure. So there's 3 different types of pressure that we're going to be talking about in the next video. Let me stop it here so it doesn't cut me off.